Welcome back to the Local Footy Show. Story with a little bit of a difference this time. Not only are we looking at football, because a lot of us also love our cricket, and a lot of people have played both games at a high level, Benny.
They have, and I came across a man, Ian Sutton, who really enjoys, he's a keen collector of stories of cricket and football, and he's got a steel trap for all these sorts of things, and he just loves to be able to tell you all about the cricketers and the footballers that were able to combine both sports.
To be good enough to play two sports like Australian rules football and Test cricket at elite level is uncanny. Let's start with the founder of Australian rules football, Tom Wills. Tom Wills was the Geelong captain coach, and he was also the Victorian cricket captain, and he devised Australian rules football in the 1850s and umpired the famous match, the first match of Australian rules between the two colleges in Melbourne in 1858. He was a major person and started the whole of Australian rules football, and would have played Test cricket except it didn't exist in that particular time. One famous incident occurred in the 1870s when there was a riot in a cricket match in Sydney involving a Victorian umpire named George Coulthard. And George Coulthard was a famous Australian rules footballer and won the equivalent of the Brownlow medal, which hadn't been invented in those days either. And he umpired a match. The riot ensued, and the fourth Test match that would have been played was cancelled with George up one end of the pitch. He played football for Carlton in the 1870s and 1880s, and he was sort of like a Ron Barassi of the 1880s, and quite amazingly, he umpired a Test match. He was a player for Melbourne in the district cricket competition, and he died at 27 years of age. He put a lot into a very short lifetime. Now, the fellow up the other end from George Coulthard was a fellow called Edmund Barton. This is 1879. In 1901, he became Australia's first Prime Minister. There's been 4 Test cricket captains who have played AFL, VFL football or South Australian football. There's been Warwick Armstrong, who played for South Melbourne. There's been Victor Richardson, who played was captain also of the South Australian football team. George Giffen, who played for Norwood in South Australia, and Clem Hill, who was a star for the South Adelaide football team. The 4 men who played Australian rules football at the elite level and captained their country at Test cricket had a total of 29 Test matches as captain for 19 wins, a significant contribution. Probably the most famous of all was Warwick Armstrong. He was the full forward for South Melbourne in 1899 and Test cricket captain for Australia. When he finished, he was 140 kilos, which is a bit hard to imagine him playing at a full forward, but he was only about 83 kilos when he did that as a young man. Armstrong was involved in the series in 1921, where Australia beat England 5-0, and this South Melbourne full forward was also part of one of the biggest upheavals in Test cricket history, when in 1912 he and 4 others refused to go to England. As a result of that, there were Australian players chosen who didn't play before. One of them was Jimmy Matthews. Matthews played for University, and he was a rover and forward and quite a goal sneak. And Jimmy Matthews became the only player in Test history to take 2 hat-tricks in one match. And there's only been 3 or 4 players who have taken 2 hat-tricks, and Jimmy Matthews is one of them, and he was a VFL footballer. And just strangely enough, but the wicketkeeper who was keeping for him when he took the 2 hat-tricks was Bill Karkic, also a VFL footballer, and 2 of the men he got out were South African Test rugby players. Between the wars, there were some very interesting VFL, AFL players who played Test cricket, and one of them was Laurie Nash. Laurie Nash was probably one of the most gifted sportsmen Australia's ever produced. He played 99 VFL games. He was a member of the 1933 South Melbourne Premiership team, and he was a demon fast bowler, and he could have been used to counteract Harold Larwood and Bill Vose's body line in 1932-33, but the Australian captain Bill Woodfull wouldn't hear of it because he didn't want to fight fire with fire, and as a result Laurie only played 2 test matches, but in those 2 test matches he took 10 wickets at an average of 12, just to show how good he was. Probably Australia's best all-round sportsman was the Chappell's grandfather. Victor Richardson played for Sturt and was the South Australian football captain. He won the Margery Medal in the Sturt's premiership in 1920. He was Test cricket captain in South Africa when Bradman was ill in 35-36, and he played baseball for Australia, state golf and tennis. Now, if that is an amazing career. Victor Richardson is probably Australia's best all-round sportsman. After World War II, there's also some great all-rounders, with Sam Loxton and Keith Miller playing for St Kilda. Miller really was known as a fullback, but he also played at full forward from time to time and kicked 8 goals in a match, as did his 1948 Invincibles teammate Sam Loxton. Loxton also played for St Kilda at full forward and also kicked 8 goals in a match. And Loxton said that he always lived in Miller's shadow, and he said it was a pretty big shadow. Again, St Kilda players, as was Simon O'Donnell, who was probably the last person to play VFL football and Test cricket. George Tribe for Footscray, Gil Langley and Keith Slater for South Australia and Western Australia also played Test cricket. One of the best all-rounders, apart from Richardson, was a South Australian again called Neil Hawke. Hawke played first grade football in South Australia and Western Australia, was member of premiership teams, and I saw him, probably dating myself here, but I saw him in 1963 play full forward for South Australia when they were victorious against Victoria on the MCG for the very first time. He injured his shoulder in that match, but in the following January, I also, from the same Southern stand, watched him open the bowling with Graham McKenzie in the second test against South Africa. The same man on the same ground, 6 months apart. Graham Watson played for Melbourne, and so did Max Walker. Walker came over from Tasmania as a full forward for the Demons. He became a qualified architect. He wrote 15 books. He became a Test cricket commentator. He played Test cricket. He made 50s with a bat and got 6 for 15 one day against Pakistan. The only thing he didn't do was play full forward for Melbourne, and what he was brought across to do. He played in the ruck and as a defender. Graham Watson was hit in the head by the fabulous Tony Greig, and it wasn't funny because Watson lost more than 20 pints of blood. He had to have 20 pints of blood as into his body during a stay in hospital of more than a month after being hit in the head and opening up an artery. And the transfusions eventually stopped when the bleeding stopped, and they said he never played cricket again. 6 months later, he was in the Australian Test team in England and played Test cricket again 6 months after the doctor said he'd never play again. Graham Watson played on the wing for the Demons, and he displaced Bluey Adams on the wing for the Demons in the 1964 season, the last time Melbourne won the premiership. So Watson again was a great player, and he was the first player to play Shield cricket for 3 states. Jeff Morrow was a Test cricket umpire and an AFL umpire. He umpired over 60 games of AFL football. He didn't actually umpire a Test cricket match, but he was the 3rd umpire in one match for the Test team. Another one was Alan Froggy Thompson, not Jeff Thompson, but Froggy Thompson, a Test bowler. I saw him destroy the Englishman on the Melbourne cricket ground for Victoria one day, and the Englishman sucked in the Australian selectors and put Thompson in the Test team, and they really stitched him up. And Froggy only played a handful of Test matches, but he was a very unusual bowler with a windmill action, and he also umpired half a dozen VFL matches. Ian Redpath was an amateur footballer for Victoria, as was Sheehan, but in the first test that Redpath played, when I saw him in that same match that Hawke played against South Africa in 1964, Redpath was the last amateur Test cricketer. He wanted to maintain his amateur status, because he was playing Victorian amateur football for the Geelong Old Collegians and Victoria. From Crompton, Neil Crompton for Melbourne, played more than 40 matches as a middle order batsman for Victoria, and he kicked the winning goal in Melbourne's last premiership in 1964. And Peter Bedford won the Brownlow medal, and I saw him make a century against the West Indies on the Melbourne cricket ground. Hawthorn's Ian Law excelled at both sports, as too did Craig Bradley of Carlton and the will-o'-the-wisp Blair Campbell of Richmond. No doubt there are some current players who have the necessary skills to succeed at two sports. However, with today's professional demands, it is very unlikely that we will see in the future anybody succeeding in both Australian rules football and Test cricket as we've seen in the past.